The day Ethan Cole won the most important case of his career, the entire courtroom stood still for a moment before erupting into quiet disbelief. The jury had returned a verdict that would make headlines across the country, a verdict that turned a man accused of a brutal crime into a free citizen again. Cameras flashed, reporters rushed forward, and Ethan stood there absorbing it all, his expression calm, controlled, almost detached. He had done what he was trained to do, what he had built his entire life around. He defended his client, dismantled the prosecution, and secured a victory that most lawyers only dream about. But what no one saw, what no one could have known in that moment, was that this victory would follow him for years, not as a triumph, but as something far heavier. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this is not just a story about law or justice, it is about consequences that refuse to stay buried. Ethan Cole was known for precision, for control, and for winning cases that others wouldn't even touch. He had built his reputation on taking the impossible and turning it into victory. His client in that case, a man named Daniel Reeves, had been accused of a violent crime that had shocked a small community. The evidence seemed overwhelming at first glance, but Ethan saw something others didn't, or at least, that's what he told himself. He questioned every witness, challenged every piece of evidence, and slowly created doubt where certainty once existed. By the time the trial ended, the jury no longer saw a clear picture of guilt. They saw confusion, contradictions, and reasonable doubt. And in the legal world, that was enough. Daniel Reeves walked free, and Ethan Cole became a name everyone recognized. At home, Ethan's life was quiet, almost the opposite of his courtroom persona. His daughter, Lily, was the center of that world. She was 16, thoughtful, observant, and had a way of asking questions that made Ethan pause longer than he was comfortable with. She admired her father, but she didn't fully understand what he did. To her, he was just someone who worked too much but always made time to listen when it mattered. In the weeks after the trial, life seemed to settle into its usual rhythm. Interviews slowed down, the media moved on, and Ethan returned to new cases. But small things began to shift in ways that didn't immediately make sense. It started with a feeling he couldn't quite explain, like something unfinished lingering just out of sight. The first sign was subtle. A letter arrived at Ethan's office with no return address, just his name written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Inside was a single sentence: "You know the truth, even if you refuse to admit it." Ethan read it twice, then folded it and placed it in his desk drawer. Anonymous messages were not unusual in his line of work. People were angry, emotional, sometimes unstable. He told himself it meant nothing. But that night, as he sat at the dinner table with Lily, he found himself watching her more closely than usual, as if trying to memorize something he couldn't yet define. She noticed, of course, and asked if something was wrong. He smiled, reassured her, and changed the subject, but the unease stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Days later, another message arrived, this time not at his office but at his home. The handwriting was the same, the tone more direct. "Some truths don't stay buried forever." Ethan felt a tightening in his chest as he read it. This was different. Whoever was sending these messages knew where he lived. He began to retrace the steps of the case in his mind, replaying moments from the trial, conversations with his client, details that once seemed insignificant. Daniel Reeves had always maintained his innocence, his story consistent, his demeanor controlled. But there had been moments, brief flashes, where something felt off. Ethan had dismissed them at the time, focusing instead on the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. That was his job. That was what he was paid to do. Then Lily mentioned something that made everything shift. She told him about a man she had seen near her school, someone who seemed to appear more than once, always at a distance, always watching. At first, Ethan tried to remain calm, asking questions, gathering details. But as she described the man's posture, the way he stood, the stillness in his movements, something in Ethan's memory clicked into place. It was not a clear image, not a full recognition, but enough to make his thoughts race. He reassured Lily, told her it was probably nothing, but inside, a realization was beginning to form, one he was not ready to accept. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He went back to his office, pulled out the old case files, and began reviewing everything from the beginning. Photos, transcripts, evidence logs, witness statements. He looked at them not as a defense attorney trying to win, but as someone searching for the truth. And slowly, painfully, patterns began to emerge. Small details he had overlooked, inconsistencies he had explained away, moments where his client's story didn't fully align with the facts. The more he looked, the clearer it became. The man he had defended so fiercely, the man he had helped walk free, had not been telling the truth. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the weight of that realization settling over him. "I caused this," he whispered, the words barely audible even in the silence of the room. The messages continued, each one more direct than the last. "You gave him freedom. You opened the door. Now watch what happens next." Ethan's focus shifted entirely to Lily. He began driving her to school, picking her up early, watching every movement, every unfamiliar face. He installed cameras around the house, changed routines, and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy that neither of them truly felt anymore. Lily started to notice the change, the tension, the way her father's eyes were always scanning, always alert. She asked questions, but Ethan struggled to answer them honestly. How do you tell your child that the danger in her life might exist because of something you did? Then came the moment that confirmed everything. Ethan saw him, not in a memory, not in a photograph, but standing across the street from his home, watching Daniel Reeves. There was no doubt this time. The same stillness, the same controlled presence, the same expression Ethan had seen countless times during the trial. For a brief second, their eyes met, and in that moment, Ethan understood something with absolute clarity. This was not random. This was deliberate. Daniel knew exactly who Ethan was, where he lived, and who mattered most to him. And the realization hit harder than anything else had so far. This wasn't just about guilt anymore. This was about consequences that had found their way back. Ethan contacted the authorities, but without concrete evidence of a crime, there was little they could do. Daniel Reeves was a free man, legally cleared, his past sealed by the verdict Ethan himself had secured. The system that Ethan had trusted, the system he had mastered, now stood as a barrier between him and the protection he needed. He began documenting everything, every sighting, every message, every detail, building a case not as a defense attorney, but as a man trying to correct a mistake that could no longer be undone easily. And with every step, the same thought echoed in his mind, growing louder, more unavoidable. He hadn't just defended the wrong man. He had given him the opportunity to return, to choose his next target, to step back into a life that should have been taken from him. As days turned into weeks, the pressure intensified. Lily's world began to shrink under the weight of precautions and fear she didn't fully understand. Ethan watched it happen, knowing that every restriction, every moment of anxiety traced back to that single case, that single decision, that single victory. He had spent his life believing in the idea that his role was to ensure fairness, to challenge the system, to protect the rights of his clients. But now, standing in the middle of a situation he could not control, he was forced to confront a different reality. Sometimes, winning doesn't end the story. Sometimes, it begins something far worse. And for Ethan Cole, the case that built his career had become the very thing threatening to destroy everything he cared about. The realization did not come all at once. It arrived in fragments, scattered across documents Ethan Cole had once believed he understood completely. As he sat in his office surrounded by case files, transcripts, and photographs from the Daniel Reeves trial, something began to shift in the way he saw it all. The arguments he had made, the doubts he had planted, the narrative he had carefully constructed for the jury, it all started to feel incomplete. Not wrong in a legal sense, but wrong in a way that was harder to define and impossible to ignore. And then, buried deep in the original evidence logs, he found a name he had not thought about in years: Marcus Hale. The man the prosecution had pointed to as the alternative suspect, the man Ethan had systematically dismantled in court, turning him from a possibility into a certainty in the minds of everyone watching. Marcus Hale had not walked free. Unlike Daniel Reeves, Marcus did not have a defense built on precision and strategy. He had been questioned, pressured, and eventually charged in connection with a related incident that surfaced during the investigation. It was a weaker case, built more on circumstance than fact, but it had been enough. Enough to send him to prison, enough to label him as a man capable of violence, enough to erase any chance of him rebuilding his life. Ethan remembered the moment clearly now, standing in court, presenting Marcus as a man with motive, with opportunity, with inconsistencies that could not be ignored. It had strengthened his own case, redirected suspicion, and created the doubt he needed to win. At the time, it was strategy. Now, it felt like something else entirely. Ethan began searching for updates on Marcus Hale, expecting to find records, appeals, something that would tell him where the man was now. What he found instead forced him to stop reading for several seconds, as if his mind needed time to process what his eyes had already seen. Marcus Hale had died 3 years earlier. Official reports listed it as a medical complication, something that had gone untreated for too long inside the prison system. There were no headlines, no public outcry, no deeper investigation. Just a quiet ending to a life that had already been reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. Ethan leaned back slowly, the weight of that information settling into something heavy and unmovable. The man he had helped paint as dangerous, as suspicious, as worthy of scrutiny, had spent his final years behind bars, and Ethan had played a role in putting him there. The room felt smaller as Ethan continued reading. There were letters Marcus had written, appeals that had been denied, statements where he insisted on his innocence. At the time, Ethan had dismissed them as expected, the words of a man trying to escape consequences. Now, reading them again, they carried a different tone. Not desperation, but clarity. Not manipulation, but frustration at not being believed. And woven through those letters were details, small but consistent, pointing away from Marcus and back toward the case Ethan thought he had already resolved. Toward Daniel Reeves. The same man Ethan had defended, the same man who had walked free, the same man now appearing in the shadows of his own life, watching, waiting, reminding him that the past was not as settled as it once seemed. Ethan's thoughts began to connect in ways he could no longer control. Daniel Reeves had not just avoided conviction. He had benefited from it in ways that extended far beyond the courtroom. While Marcus Hale was being investigated, charged, and ultimately imprisoned, Daniel had remained untouched, his narrative intact, his freedom unquestioned. It was a shift in attention, a redirection of focus, and Ethan had been the one to make it happen. Every question he asked, every argument he made, every doubt he introduced had pushed the spotlight away from Daniel and onto Marcus. And the system had followed that path, step by step, until it reached a conclusion that now felt deeply flawed. At home, Ethan found it harder to look at Lily without thinking about Marcus Hale, about the years he had lost, the life he never got to return to, the silence that followed his death. Lily noticed the change in her father more than ever now. The distance in his thoughts, the way he paused before answering simple questions, the way his attention seemed split between the present and something he could not let go of. She asked him one evening why he looked at her the way he did, as if he was trying to protect her from something she couldn't see. Ethan struggled to respond because the truth was too complicated, too heavy, and too connected to choices he could never undo. The evidence continued to surface in small, unsettling ways. Old witnesses who had been overlooked came forward quietly, details that had once seemed irrelevant began to align differently, and pieces of the timeline that Ethan had once dismissed now demanded attention. None of it was enough on its own, but together, it painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Marcus Hale had not been the man Ethan presented in court. He had been something else entirely. And Daniel Reeves, the man who had benefited from that narrative, was no longer just a past client. He was a presence that refused to fade, a reminder that the truth had been redirected rather than revealed. Ethan reached a point where he could no longer separate his past decisions from his present reality. The messages, the sightings, the growing sense that Daniel was closer than he should be, all of it connected back to a single chain of events that began in that courtroom. He had not just defended a man who may have been guilty. He had helped create the conditions that allowed an innocent man to be punished in his place. The legal victory that once defined his career now felt like a fracture running through everything he had built since. And as that realization settled into something permanent, one thought became impossible to escape. This was no longer just about what happened years ago. This was about what happens next, and whether the truth, once uncovered, could do anything to correct a past that had already taken so much. The first letter had unsettled Ethan Cole, but it was the second that refused to leave his mind. It arrived without warning, slipped between ordinary mail as if it belonged there, addressed in the same careful handwriting he had already begun to recognize. This time the message was shorter, more direct, and far more personal. "You knew, didn't you?" Ethan read it slowly once, then again, as if the meaning might change if he gave it enough time. But it didn't. The words stayed exactly where they were, sharp and deliberate, forcing him to confront a question he had been trying to avoid ever since he reopened the Daniel Reeves case. Because the truth was no longer something distant or theoretical. It was something that was being handed back to him piece by piece, and someone out there knew exactly how to deliver it. Ethan tried to approach it the way he approached everything else, with logic, structure, and control. He analyzed the paper, the ink, the handwriting, looking for anything that could point to a source. But there was nothing obvious, nothing that stood out beyond the message itself. Whoever was sending these letters understood restraint. They knew how to say just enough without revealing anything more. And that made it worse because it meant this was not random. This was intentional, measured, and patient. As the days passed, Ethan began to notice other things, details that might have gone unnoticed before but now felt impossible to ignore. A car parked too long across the street. A figure standing at the edge of a crowd, just still enough to draw attention. Moments that, on their own, meant very little, but together created a pattern that was becoming harder to dismiss. At home, Lily could feel the shift even if she didn't fully understand it. Ethan had become more alert, more aware of every sound, every movement, every unexpected detail. He checked the locks more than once, looked out the windows longer than necessary, and kept his phone within reach at all times. Lily asked him again if something was wrong, and this time, he didn't answer right away. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a brief moment it felt like he was deciding how much of the truth she could handle. But the words never came. Instead, he reassured her in the same quiet tone, telling her everything was fine, even though both of them knew that something had changed. The third message didn't come as a letter. It came as a photograph. No envelope, no note, just an image left at his office door early in the morning before anyone else arrived. Ethan picked it up slowly, his mind already anticipating something he didn't want to see. It was a picture of Lily, taken from a distance outside her school. She was unaware, mid-conversation with a friend, completely exposed to whoever had been watching. On the back of the photograph, written in the same precise handwriting, were just a few words. "Truth has a way of finding its way back." Ethan felt a cold stillness settle over him as he stared at the image. This was no longer a suggestion or a warning. It was proof. Proof that someone was close enough to observe, close enough to act, and patient enough to wait. Ethan's thoughts immediately returned to Daniel Reeves. The connection felt obvious, almost unavoidable. Daniel had the motive, the history, and now the presence. But something about it didn't fully align. The letters, the tone, the careful packing of each message, it all suggested something more deliberate than intimidation. This wasn't just about fear. It was about exposure. Whoever was behind this wasn't simply watching Ethan. They were guiding him, forcing him to revisit the past step by step, leading him toward a conclusion he was already beginning to accept. And that realization introduced a new question, one that unsettled him even more than the letters themselves. What if this wasn't just Daniel Reeves? What if someone else knew the truth too? Ethan returned to the case files again, this time focusing less on the evidence and more on the people connected to it. Witnesses, investigators, anyone who might have seen something that didn't fit the narrative presented in court. And as he worked through the names, one detail stood out in a way it hadn't before. Marcus Hale had a sister. Her name appeared briefly in the records, mentioned only in passing during the early stages of the investigation. She had tried to speak on his behalf, insisting that he was being misrepresented, that the focus on him was misplaced. But her statements had never gained traction, dismissed as emotional and unsupported. Ethan had barely acknowledged her at the time. Now, her absence from everything that followed felt significant. The next letter arrived that same night, as if responding to his thoughts before he had fully formed them. This time, it was left inside his house. Not at the door, not in the mailbox, but inside, placed carefully on the table in the hallway where he would see it the moment he walked in. Ethan stopped as soon as he noticed it, every instinct telling him that the situation had just crossed into something far more serious. He picked up the letter slowly, his mind already racing through possibilities he could no longer control. The message inside was longer than the others, but no less precise. You built your truth on what you wanted to believe. Now you're ready to see what you refused to look at. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest as he read the words, because they echoed something he had already begun to understand on his own. From that point on, the sense of being watched was no longer a question. It was a certainty. Every movement, every decision, every attempt to regain control felt like it was being observed from somewhere just out of reach. Ethan installed more security, contacted people he trusted, and tried to create some form of protection around Lily, but none of it addressed the core of the problem. This wasn't just about safety. This was about truth, and the closer Ethan got to it, the more it seemed to close in on him from all sides. The past was no longer something he could revisit on his own terms. It was being brought back to him, carefully, deliberately, and with a purpose he had yet to fully understand. And as the letters continued, each one pulling him deeper into a version of the case he had never allowed himself to see, Ethan Cole reached a point where denial was no longer possible. Someone knew what really happened. Someone had been waiting for the right moment to make sure he saw it too. And whatever came next was not going to be about winning or losing, guilt or innocence. It was going to be about facing a truth that had already cost one man his life, and might be preparing to take something else in return. The shift from fear to action came quietly, almost without Ethan Cole realizing it had happened. For weeks, he had been reacting, following the trail of letters, photographs, and fragments of truth that someone had been placing in front of him with deliberate precision. But the moment he received the official notice, everything changed. Daniel Reeves had been arrested again. The charges were different this time, tied to a recent incident that carried echoes of the past, patterns Ethan could recognize even before reading the full report. And before he could fully process what it meant, the second part of the notice settled in. Daniel Reeves had requested him by name. Not just any lawyer, not a public defender, but Ethan Cole, the same man who had once secured his freedom. Ethan read the document more than once, his expression steady but his thoughts anything but. This was not coincidence. This was design. Every message, every photograph, every calculated step had been leading to this moment. Daniel Reeves was not just back in the system, he was pulling Ethan back in with him. For a brief moment, Ethan considered refusing. Walking away would have been the simplest option, the safest one for Lily, the clearest line between his past mistakes and his present responsibilities. But the truth he had uncovered would not allow that. If he stepped away now, Daniel would find another defense, another narrative, another path to freedom. And Marcus Hale would remain what the system had already decided he was. Ethan understood something with clarity in that moment. This was the only opportunity he would ever have to correct what he had set in motion. When Ethan entered the courtroom again, the familiarity of it felt different. The same structure, the same process, the same expectations, but none of the certainty he once carried. Daniel Reeves sat at the defense table, composed as always, his expression calm, almost welcoming. When their eyes met, there was recognition, but also something else, something that felt like anticipation. As if Daniel had been waiting for this exact moment, this exact confrontation. Ethan took his place, aware that every move he made from this point forward would be watched, not just by the court, but by the man sitting beside him, and possibly by whoever had been sending the letters all along. The internal conflict began immediately. As a defense attorney, Ethan's role was clear: protect his client, challenge the prosecution, create doubt. But everything he now knew, everything he had uncovered about Marcus Hale, about the inconsistencies in Daniel's story, about the patterns that had resurfaced, pushed him in the opposite direction. He was no longer just defending a client. He was standing next to a man he believed had manipulated him once before and was prepared to do it again. The difference now was that Ethan was aware of it, and that awareness changed the way he approached everything. Ethan began constructing a defense that looked familiar on the surface but carried a different purpose underneath. He challenged the prosecution where necessary, but not in ways that would dismantle the case entirely. He allowed certain details to remain, details that might seem minor to an outside observer but were critical to the larger picture he was building. It was a careful balance, one that required precision and restraint. Too aggressive, and he risked repeating the past. Too passive, and Daniel might slip through the system once again. Every question Ethan asked, every objection he raised, every moment of silence he allowed in the courtroom became part of a larger strategy that only he fully understood. Daniel Reeves noticed the shift. It was subtle at first, a slight pause before answering certain questions, a glance that lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. During private meetings, Daniel began to test the boundaries, asking Ethan questions that seemed simple but carried deeper intent. "You still believe in winning, don't you?" he asked at one point, his tone calm, almost conversational. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation, responding in the same controlled manner he had always used. But internally, the meaning of that question stayed with him. Because this time, winning did not mean the same thing it once did. As the trial progressed, Ethan introduced elements that began to shift the narrative in ways the prosecution had not anticipated. He revisited aspects of the original case, bringing up details connected to Marcus Hale, not as a direct accusation, but as context that could not be ignored. He framed questions in a way that forced witnesses to acknowledge gaps, inconsistencies, and overlooked connections. It was not enough to prove everything outright, but it was enough to create a space where the truth could begin to surface. And as that space widened, the tension in the courtroom grew, not just from the legal arguments, but from the unspoken understanding that something deeper was unfolding. The psychological pressure between Ethan and Daniel became impossible to ignore. In moments when the court paused, when the focus shifted away from them, Daniel would watch Ethan with an intensity that felt calculated. There was no fear in his expression, no visible concern about the direction the case was taking. Instead, there was something closer to curiosity, as if he was observing how far Ethan was willing to go this time. And in those moments, Ethan understood that this was not just a legal battle. This was a confrontation between two people who knew each other in ways no one else in that room did. The legal traps began to take shape as Ethan carefully positioned key pieces of information at critical moments. He allowed certain testimonies to stand unchallenged, knowing they would conflict with statements Daniel had made previously. He introduced timelines that aligned in ways that could not be easily dismissed. And slowly, without making it obvious, he created a framework where the truth, once hidden, could no longer remain entirely out of view. It was not a direct attack. It was something more controlled, more deliberate, designed to let the system reach a conclusion it had once avoided. As the trial moved closer to its final stages, Ethan felt the weight of everything he had done, both in the past and in the present. This was not redemption in the way people often imagined it. It was not clean or simple or guaranteed to succeed. It was uncertain, complicated, and carried risks that extended far beyond the courtroom. But it was necessary. Because standing there, facing the same man he had once helped set free, Ethan Cole understood that this was his only chance to confront the consequences of that decision in a way that might finally bring the truth into the open. And this time, he was no longer interested in winning for the sake of victory. He was focused on something else entirely, ensuring that what happened before would not happen again, no matter the cost. The truth did not break Ethan Cole all at once. It settled in slowly, like something he had always known but refused to fully acknowledge. As the trial moved forward and the weight of every decision pressed harder against him, there was a moment, quiet and almost unnoticeable, where the past stopped feeling distant. It became clear, immediate, and impossible to escape. Because the reality was, this was not the first time Ethan had questioned Daniel Reeves. It was not the first time something in the case felt off, or incomplete, or just slightly out of place. Those moments had existed before, scattered throughout the original trial, brief flashes of doubt that he had learned to silence. Back then, Ethan had a choice. He could have followed those doubts, pushed deeper, asked harder questions, risked losing the case in pursuit of something uncertain. Or he could do what he had always done, what he was known for, what had built his entire career. Win. And he chose to win. He told himself it was his role, his responsibility, that the system depended on attorneys doing exactly what he was doing. He told himself that doubt was not proof, that suspicion was not evidence, that his job was not to determine truth but to challenge the prosecution. And for a while, those justifications were enough. They allowed him to stand in that courtroom, deliver his arguments, and secure a verdict that changed everything. But now, standing in that same system years later, those justifications felt different. They no longer carried the same weight, because the consequences were no longer abstract. Marcus Hale was gone. Lily was no longer safe in the way she once was, and Daniel Reeves was sitting just a few feet away from him again, not as a distant memory, but as a present reality. Ethan began to replay specific moments from the past with a clarity he had avoided before. The way Daniel answered certain questions too carefully, the slight delays before responding, the details that didn't fully align but were easy to overlook when placed next to a stronger narrative. Ethan had seen those things. He had recognized them, even if only for a second. And then he had moved past them. Because winning had been more important. That realization changed everything. Not just how Ethan saw the case, but how he saw himself. He was no longer just someone who had made a mistake or been misled. He had been aware, at least in part, and chose a path that benefited him. His career had grown from that decision. His reputation had been built on it. The recognition, the success, the opportunities that followed, all of it traced back to that moment in the courtroom where he decided that doubt was something to ignore rather than investigate. And now, sitting in the middle of a second trial involving the same man, he understood the cost of that decision in a way he never had before. Daniel Reeves seemed to sense the shift. During one of their private conversations, he leaned back slightly, studying Ethan with a calm expression that carried something unspoken beneath it. "You're different this time," Daniel said quietly, his tone measured, almost curious. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He held his composure, kept his expression controlled, but internally the words landed exactly where Daniel intended them to, because it wasn't just observation, it was recognition. Daniel knew, not just about the case, but about Ethan, about the kind of decisions he was capable of making when the stakes were high enough. The psychological tension between them deepened with every passing day. Daniel began to speak less directly, choosing his words with the same precision Ethan had once admired. There were moments where his statements carried a second meaning, subtle references that only Ethan seemed to catch. It was as if the trial had become something more than a legal process. It had turned into a conversation, one that existed beneath the surface of every argument, every question, every silence. And within that conversation, a single truth continued to emerge. This was not just about exposing Daniel Reeves. It was about confronting the version of himself that had allowed all of this to happen in the first place. As the courtroom sessions continued, Ethan's strategy became more focused, more deliberate. He no longer hesitated when introducing elements that pointed back to the original case, to Marcus Hale, to the inconsistencies that had been overlooked. But with each step forward, the weight of his past choices followed closely behind. Because every piece of truth he revealed now was a reminder of what he had chosen not to reveal before. Every question he asked carried the echo of questions he could have asked years earlier. And every moment that brought the truth closer to the surface also brought him closer to a reality he could not escape. At home, the tension reached a point where silence was no longer enough. Lily confronted him one evening, her voice steady but filled with a concern she could no longer hide. She asked him what was really happening, why everything felt different, why he looked at her like he was afraid of something he wouldn't name. Ethan listened, knowing that this moment had been coming, knowing that there was no simple way to explain what she was asking. And for the first time, he didn't try to avoid it completely. He didn't give her every detail, but he told her enough. Enough for her to understand that the danger they were facing was not random, that it was connected to something he had done. And in that moment, the distance between them shifted, replaced by something heavier, but more honest. If you've made it this far into the story, take a moment and think about this. What would you have done in Ethan Cole's position? Would you have followed the doubt, even if it meant losing everything you worked for, or would you have made the same choice he did? Let me know in the comments, because this is where the story stops being just about him and starts reflecting something deeper about all of us. As the trial approached its final phase, Ethan understood that the outcome would not erase the past. There was no version of events where Marcus Hale returned, no outcome that restored the years that had been taken, no decision that removed the consequences already set in motion. But there was still something at stake. Not just justice in the traditional sense, but accountability. Not just for Daniel Reeves, but for himself. Because the truth, once fully exposed, would not only change the way the case was remembered. It would change the way Ethan Cole was seen, the way his career was defined, and the way he would have to live with the choices he had made. And as he stood in that courtroom preparing for what would come next, one thought remained clear above everything else. This was never just about defending the wrong man. It was about knowing, even for a moment, and choosing not to act. And now, years later, that choice had come back, not quietly, not gradually, but in a way that demanded to be confronted. No matter how much it cost, because the truth doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It waits, it builds, and eventually it returns in a way that forces everything into the open, whether you're ready for it or not. Now I want you to really think about this. If you were in Ethan Cole's position, and you had even the smallest doubt that your client was lying, would you have taken the risk and followed the truth, even if it meant losing the biggest case of your life? Or would you have done exactly what he did and chosen to win? Be honest. Drop your answer in the comments, because this is where the story becomes more than just a story. It becomes a reflection of real choices people make every single day. And if this story made you question things, if it kept you thinking, if it pulled you all the way to the end, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories like this. Because the next one might be even closer to reality than you expect.